So we're now going to have the first rebuttal from the opposing team, and that's Vicky.
Okay, so Milgram's study was totally unethical. The ends do not justify the means because the results were complicated, as all the variations of the studies brought different results. For example, like some of the studies were done in less reputable places and hardly any obedience was shown. So that means that there was always some kind of demand characteristics from it being at a reputable Yale University. So there's also, they didn't need to deceive the participants. There was other experiments that they could have done, as shown in further experiments. Also, 1.3% of participants still did have negative feelings from that study. That's still 1.3% of people. That still matters. And also, yeah, that's it.
We're now going to have the first rebuttal from the affirmative team, and that's Linda.
Right, so first of all, the 1.3%, if we can go to that, 1.3% of 40 people is not even a whole person. So each person would have likely been asked a number of multiple questions, which means that the person who answered in a negative way answered positively in many of their other answers. So that is not statistically viable, the 1.3%. The high obedience was shown, and if no deception was used, the test would have been invalid and not produced results that gave a true example of human behaviour. So when it's a test for obedience, if you don't actually test obedience, you're not going to get answers to a test for obedience. So there were one of two ways of doing it, which is by making people give shocks or telling them that they were going to give shocks, and the second one was the lesser of the evils. The prods to continue, it doesn't take away the right to withdraw. The participants could stop the electric shocks at any time. They were asked to continue. They could have said no, no, no. This would have required them to obey their own free will, which people do have. They would have still got the money, and that would have shown them disobeying the authority figure, giving them orders, and that is exactly what the experiment was testing. So that was another point to prove that Milgram's test actually did show what he set out to test.
We'll now have the second rebuttal from the opposing team.
You said earlier that Milgram wanted to cause no discomfort at all, but then why were some participants reported to be self-harming, under a lot of stress, so having seizures? Some were debriefed till months later. What if it was you? How would you feel? He said also that 84% of people were happy and 1.3% reported negative feelings, but that still leaves 14% of people unaccounted for. So how would they feel? How did they feel? The statistics aren't really full there. He used fear of disobeying, he used payments, and he used an authoritative figure. He also created a sense of feeling that it's going to be alright no matter what, because before the experiment took place, the conversation between Mr. Williams and the learner was, the learner asked if he should be worried about the shocks, and Mr. Williams replied that although they could be painful, they would not be dangerous. So for the participant who's doing the job, already he's got a sense of what I'm going to do, he's not going to hurt that person anyway, so I can do it. So why would that conversation take place begin? So yeah, that's my point.
And the last word from the affirmative team is from Hannah.
Okay, so you mentioned about stress or about discomfort, but people can show signs of stress in everyday situations. We're nervous now, might be shaking, some people might run out, it's been seen in other situations, and it could be likely to result in underlying mental health issues that participants already had. He did ask them to disclose any medical information. He can't control what they do or don't disclose. So if they asked him then you know, and we're nervous now. You mentioned before that people, you implied that people didn't withdraw. They did withdraw. There was a percentage at the beginning. People did withdraw from the study when they, you know, found what they were going to be doing. So, and you mentioned about the $4.50, regardless, it was given regardless of what happened. Like Linda said, they had their own free will to make that decision to leave at any point. They were going to get their money. They were told that they could keep it. You mentioned that they weren't debriefed until some time later. Milgram was ahead of his time with the debriefing. He didn't have to do that at the time. The ethical guidelines weren't in place. So he did debrief, and it was instrumental to, that was what he was praised for and he won awards for. The debriefing was instrumental in his studies becoming what they were, because he did make sure that there was no harm. No one, you know, 84% of people didn't, said that they didn't feel any psychological harm from it, and that was even a year later when they went back to do another study on them, not a study, experiment on, no, review on them. So there was 84%, that's a high number of people that showed, you know, that they were okay, and there was no, so at the time they might have felt psychological harm, you say, there was none showing, no lasting long-term effects. Yeah, they've got personal responsibility to themselves. So there was, you know, they were reassured that their behaviour was the norm. So if they were the ones that were obedient and went to that, there was no psychological harm, because they were reassured by Milgram that the behaviour was the norm in that investigation under those circumstances, and nothing was wrong with them. So he did reassure them. It was not unethical, as there were no ethical guidelines in place. So at the time, it wasn't an unethical situation. He couldn't have predicted the results of what was going to happen. He tried his best to, you know, to say beforehand, to do the study, to ask other people, and he couldn't predict it. And at the end of the day, Milgram contributed greatly to psychology, and we're still talking about him now. How can that be a bad thing?
Wow. Okay. Thank you to our debate team.